In Lusaka, Zambia, 21-year-old Tandai clapped the loudest as her younger brother Mubita walked across the stage in his graduation gown. Her heart swelled with pride, certain this was a moment the whole family would treasure. But the joy quickly turned bitter. After the ceremony, their parents pulled out a shiny key and handed it to Mubita. "Your new car," they announced, revealing a brand new silver Toyota Prado waiting outside. Everyone cheered. Then, almost casually, her father slipped an envelope into Tandai's hand. Smiling, she thought it might be a small gift. But when she opened it, her face froze. It wasn't congratulations. It was a rent bill, telling her she now had to start paying to live at home. The hall, filled with laughter moments before, suddenly felt cold. Tandai forced a smile, but inside her chest, something cracked. She looked at Mubita, already surrounded by friends, dreaming of late-night drives in his new car. Meanwhile, she clutched that crumpled paper, wondering why her parents saw her as a burden instead of a daughter to celebrate. That night, lying awake in her small room, she replayed their words, "He's the future, you're old enough to fend for yourself." The favoritism stung more than the bill itself. It wasn't just about money, it was about being unwanted in her own home. She whispered to herself, maybe it's time to leave. And though her parents thought she would always depend on them, they had no idea that this cruel gesture had just sparked the beginning of her rise. That night, the house was filled with noise and laughter. Mubita had already called his friends, and they all crowded outside to admire the shiny silver Prado parked in the driveway. Music blasted from the car, and his friends cheered as he revved the engine, proud and loud. Tandai sat inside her small room, the rent bill crumpled tightly in her trembling hands. The paper felt heavier than stone, as if it carried all the weight of her parents' rejection. She could hear her brother laughing, his friends shouting with excitement, while her own heart sank deeper and deeper. She stared at the piece of paper again and again, as if the words might suddenly change. But they never did. It was clear. She was no longer welcome to live at home for free. She was no longer the child to be celebrated. Her parents' voices echoed in her head, "He's the future. You're old enough to fend for yourself." Those words cut sharper than knives. She wanted to cry, but no tears would come. It wasn't just a rent bill. It was a message. A message that said, "You don't matter like your brother does." In the corner of her tiny room, Tandai hugged her knees to her chest. She thought of all the nights she had stayed awake studying by candlelight, all the sacrifices she had made just to finish school and help her parents with chores. She thought of how proud she had been to watch Mubita graduate, never once feeling jealous. She had clapped for him with genuine love. And this was her reward, a demand for money, a cold reminder that she was unwanted under the same roof. The laughter from outside only grew louder. Mubita's friends shouted, "You're the man now," while he honked the horn again and again, as if announcing his victory to the world. Tandai pressed the crumpled paper against her chest, the sound of the car horn mixing with the sound of her own silent heartbreak. She wanted to walk outside, scream, and ask her parents why. But something inside stopped her. She knew the answer already. They had chosen him, not her. Lying down on her thin mattress, she stared at the cracked ceiling. The room smelled faintly of dust and candle wax, but it was the only space she could call her own. She whispered to herself, "Am I really that unwanted?" The silence answered her. She felt humiliated in the very place she was supposed to feel safe. But as the night grew darker and the sounds of the car slowly faded away, another feeling began to rise in her chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't jealousy. It was resolve. The more she stared at that rent bill, the more it seemed to transform in her mind. Maybe this wasn't just a punishment. Maybe it was a push. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. She folded the paper carefully, placed it under her pillow, and closed her eyes. She didn't know how yet, but she knew one thing for certain, this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning. The next morning, while her parents laughed over tea and Mubita showed off the new car to neighbors, Tandai packed her small bag in silence. She didn't argue. She didn't cry in front of them. She folded her clothes neatly, slipped her few books inside, and tucked the crumpled rent bill into the bottom of the bag. That paper was no longer just an insult, it was her reminder of why she had to leave. With the little savings she had earned from her part-time bookkeeping job, she decided to move out. Her heart was heavy, but her steps were steady. When she finally walked out with her bag, her parents exchanged a knowing look and smirked. Her mother whispered, "She will be back. Just give her a week." Her father nodded, certain that life outside would crush her and force her to crawl back home in tears. They didn't bother stopping her. To them, this was a lesson. To Tandai, it was freedom. She arrived in Kanyama compound with her small savings and rented a single-room apartment. The room was tiny, with cracked walls and a thin mattress lying on the floor. A weak bulb flickered above her head, and water leaked slowly from a pipe outside the door. But as she looked around, she smiled faintly. It wasn't much, but it was hers. For the first time, she felt she could breathe without judgment, without favoritism. This little room became her new beginning. That first night, she sat on the mattress and counted her remaining coins carefully. It wasn't enough for comfort, but it was enough to survive. She promised herself that no matter how hard things got, she would not run back to the house where she was treated like she didn't matter. The silence of her new room was different from the silence of her parents' home. This silence carried peace, not humiliation. Her parents, back at home, joked that she would soon knock on the door, begging to return. Mubita laughed too, sure that his sister would never make it outside on her own. None of them knew what was burning quietly inside her. They mistook her silence for weakness, but it was strength gathering in the shadows. Every morning, Tandai woke up early, ironed her clothes carefully, and walked to her bookkeeping job. At night, she studied new skills on her old second-hand laptop, determined to learn something more than what life had handed her. The neighbors in Kanyama saw her walking with purpose, and some admired her courage, though she kept to herself. Deep down, she knew that one day she would return, not as a failure crawling back home, but as someone her parents would never be able to ignore again. Tandai's choice to walk away was quiet, but inside her heart a storm was forming. What her parents thought was the end of her strength was only the beginning of her rise. Months passed, and Tandai's life in her little room at Kanyama compound was far from easy. The cracked walls let in the cold, and the mattress was thin and uncomfortable, but she refused to complain. Every day she woke up with determination in her eyes. She went to her bookkeeping job during the day, working carefully with numbers and saving every little coin she could. At night, while most people slept, she sat in front of her old second-hand laptop, the screen flickering in the dark, searching for online jobs. She typed slowly at first, making mistakes, but she refused to give up. She took small freelancing tasks, writing short reports, entering data, balancing small accounts for strangers across the world. Each time she got paid, even a little, she felt her hope grow stronger. But freelancing was not all she did. On weekends she sold handmade beadwork in the busy streets, bracelets and necklaces she had learned to make as a child. Children in the neighborhood adored her, and soon she began tutoring them in math, charging just enough to buy food and pay her rent. The work was tiring. Some nights she fell asleep with her head on her laptop, the glow of the screen still lighting her face. But little by little, the money began to grow. She was no longer just surviving. She was slowly building something bigger than even she imagined. One afternoon, while helping a friend deliver documents, she met Mr. Chanda, a local investor. He noticed her calm confidence and the way she spoke about numbers. Curious, he asked her about her work. Tandai explained her freelancing and her small bookkeeping job. Instead of dismissing her, he was impressed. "You remind me of myself when I was starting out," he told her. He gave her a chance to manage the accounts of his new startup. Nervous but determined, she accepted. She worked day and night to make sure every figure was perfect. The risk paid off. The company grew, and so did her role. Within months, her salary was more than she had ever dreamed. She upgraded her laptop, furnished her tiny apartment, and even started saving for something bigger. She never forgot the nights she went hungry, and that memory pushed her to keep working harder. Her parents thought she would fail, but instead she was rising higher than they ever expected. By the end of the year, Tendai was no longer just the girl renting a small room in Kanyama. She was a young woman earning more than both her parents combined. She walked with quiet pride, never boastful, but strong. Her neighbors admired her discipline, children respected her, and even business people noticed her growing confidence. She had turned rejection into motivation, and humiliation into fuel. What her parents thought was her downfall had become her greatest blessing. They had forced her out, but without knowing it, they had pushed her straight into her destiny. Back at home, life was not as shiny as it first seemed. Mubita's brand new silver Prado that once drew cheers from neighbors now sat quietly in the driveway, gathering dust. The car that was meant to prove he was the future quickly turned into a burden. Fuel prices were high, repairs were costly, and Mubita had no stable job to keep up with the expenses. At first, he tried to keep up appearances, driving around with his friends, buying drinks, and showing off. But soon his pockets ran dry. The excitement of graduation faded, and reality began to bite. His once loud laughter turned into long hours of silence inside the house, as he avoided calls from friends he could no longer impress. Meanwhile, his parents, who had put all their hopes on him, found themselves drowning in problems. Bills piled up on the table, debts grew heavier, and the threat of foreclosure hung over their heads like a storm cloud. The same home that once rang with pride now echoed with arguments and stress. They had believed Mubita would lift them higher, but instead, he had dragged them into deeper struggles. The car they thought was a blessing had become a symbol of their mistakes. But outside those walls, whispers began to spread. Neighbors who once pitied Tendai now spoke of her with admiration. People said, "She left with nothing but has returned with everything." In markets and bus stops, her name was mentioned with respect. Stories of the young woman who worked nights, who built herself from the ground up, reached every corner of the community. Mothers told their daughters about her determination, and men who once ignored her greeted her with nods of respect. Tendai herself did not boast or shout about her success. She moved quietly, but her progress could not be hidden. She was seen stepping out of meetings in neat dresses, carrying files with confidence. Her small single room had grown into something bigger, her own car, her own duplex, her own business account. While her parents were sinking, she was rising higher than anyone imagined. At home, the tension thickened. Mubita often sat staring at the silent Prado, unable to believe how quickly things had changed. His parents avoided the neighbors, embarrassed by their debts and their son's failure. Yet everywhere they turned, they heard the same thing: "Your daughter is doing so well. You must be proud." Those words, meant as compliments, burned in their hearts. Pride mixed with shame, regret mixed with fear. The shocking reversal was clear to everyone. The daughter they had pushed aside had become the one everyone looked up to, while the son they had crowned the future was stuck in the past. Desperation began to creep into their home, and for the first time, they realized the truth: they had underestimated the strength of the daughter they once humiliated. One humid evening, as the sound of crickets filled the night outside, Tendai sat in her polished office finishing up a stack of files. The air conditioner hummed softly, her desk was neatly arranged, and her reflection glowed faintly on the glass window. Life had changed so much from the days she sat on a thin mattress in Kanyama compound. She was now a woman in charge, respected, independent, and secure. Just as she was about to shut down her laptop, her phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID made her pause. It was her father. Her heart skipped for a moment. She hadn't spoken to him in weeks, only brief messages here and there. Slowly, she picked up. On the other end, she didn't hear the usual firmness in his voice. Instead, it cracked, low and broken. Tandai, please, we need your help. For a long second, she said nothing. The words hung in the air, heavy, trembling, almost desperate. This was the same man who once slipped her a rent bill while giving her brother a brand new car. The same parents who told her she was old enough to fend for herself. Now, they were the ones calling her with shaking voices. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping the desk lightly. Images flooded her mind, the night she held that rent bill in her tiny room, the humiliation that burned in her chest, the nights she went hungry while Mubita showed off the Prado. And now here she was, in her own office, hearing them beg. The power balance had shifted completely. Her father's voice grew softer, almost pleading. He explained how debts had grown beyond control, how the house was at risk, how Mubita's car had become nothing but a burden. Every word was laced with regret and shame. For the first time in her life, Tandai could hear fear in her father's tone. He was no longer the proud man teaching her lessons. He was a desperate father reaching out to the daughter he had dismissed. Tandai stayed quiet for a moment, letting the silence stretch. She could hear her mother in the background, whispering, urging him to ask properly. She felt a strange mix of emotions, pain, anger, and yet, deep down, compassion. She had dreamed of this moment, the day they would realize her worth, but now that it had come, it felt both powerful and heavy. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but steady. "So now you remember me?" Her father swallowed hard, his voice almost breaking. "We need you, Tandai. Please." She looked around her office, the polished desk, the company logo shining on the wall, the files of businesses trusting her with their money. She realized just how far she had come. The girl who once cried over a rent bill was now the woman holding the future of her family in her hands. And for the first time, they knew it too. The next Sunday afternoon, Tandai agreed to meet her parents. She drove herself to the same house where she had once been told she was unwanted. As she parked outside, she saw the Prado, still shiny but unmoving, like a forgotten trophy of failure. She took a deep breath and walked inside. The dining table was set, the same one where she had once opened an envelope that broke her heart. This time, however, she was not the girl trembling with shame. She was a woman with power in her steps and confidence in her eyes. Her parents sat stiffly, waiting. Mubita lingered nearby, his face uneasy, as if he already knew what was coming. The air in the room was thick, heavy with silence. They looked at her with a mix of pride and desperation, but none of them spoke first. Tandai pulled out an envelope from her handbag and placed it gently on the table. Her father reached for it quickly, perhaps thinking it was money. But when he opened it, his hands froze. Inside were documents. Bank statements showing her thriving business account, title deeds proving she owned her own duplex, and registration papers for her car. The silence grew heavier as her parents' eyes widened. Tandai looked directly at them, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the room. "You gave me a rent bill," she said slowly, each word sinking deep. "I built an empire with it." The sentence landed like a stone in water, sending ripples across the table. No one moved. Mubita lowered his gaze, shame washing over his face. Her mother covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Her father sat back in his chair, speechless, the very man who once mocked her now staring at the undeniable truth. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Tandai let the silence stretch. She wanted them to feel the weight of what they had done, the pain of pushing her away, and the shock of realizing she had risen higher than they ever believed she could. She didn't shout, she didn't cry, she didn't need to. Her success spoke louder than anything else could. Her father finally whispered, "We didn't know, we didn't think," but his voice cracked before he could finish. Her mother reached out a trembling hand as if to touch her, but Tandai remained still, her eyes steady. She had waited for this moment not to boast, but to show them what rejection had created. She stood slowly, gathering the documents back into the envelope. "I am not here to prove myself," she said softly. "I am here so you understand what you almost destroyed." Then she pushed the envelope back toward them. "This is who I am now." The power in her tone filled the room. The girl they once dismissed had returned, not broken, but stronger than all of them combined. And in that silence, her parents knew the truth: they had underestimated the daughter who had turned their rejection into triumph. Her parents sat in silence, their pride shattered, their voices trembling as they begged her not to turn her back on them. For the first time, they were the ones pleading, and she was the one holding all the power. But Tandai wasn't cruel. She had carried pain, yes, but she refused to let bitterness control her. She listened to their words carefully, her eyes calm, her heart steady. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. She told them she would help with food and with paying off some debts, but she laid down clear conditions. There would be no more favoritism. No more humiliation. No more treating her like she was less than her brother. The weight of her words filled the room. Mubita stared at the floor, ashamed, while her mother wiped silent tears from her face. Her father only nodded slowly, knowing he had no choice but to agree. The same daughter they had pushed aside was now the one keeping the family from collapsing. Without her, they would lose everything. As she stood to leave, her presence felt larger than ever before. The neighbors soon whispered about what had happened. They told each other how the girl who had once been forced to leave her parents' home with nothing had returned stronger, richer, and more respected than anyone imagined. Her story spread quickly, carried by admiration and disbelief. People said, she left with nothing, but came back with everything. And in that moment, Tandai's name became a symbol of strength, the daughter who turned rejection into power, the girl who refused to break, the woman who became the very backbone of her family's survival.